Levitsky is a professor of government at Harvard University and the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. He's also an expert on Peruvian politics. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, June. It's great to be here.
The second round of the Peruvian elections is coming up on June 6th. Many of the people who are listening are very familiar with Peruvian politics, but I'm sure there are others of our listeners who don't know anything. So could we begin from scratch by describing the candidates to us?
Well, the two candidates are very, very different, and I think from the perspective of many, many Peruvians, quite problematic. On the one hand, we have Keiko Fujimori, whose father, Alberto Fujimori, governed as an autocrat during the 1990s, but retained, eventually went into exile, was extradited and imprisoned for corruption and human rights violations. He's in prison today. But retained a fair amount of public support. And upon that support, his followers and eventually his daughter built a political party. So here is a fairly right-wing daughter of former autocrat. Her opponent is the outsider of all outsiders. Pedro Castillo is a left-leaning teacher and teachers union leader from a fairly remote province of Cajamarca, who's never held elected office. In fact, he ran for mayor of his hometown, population 4,500, and lost. And then managed as the candidate of a small, pretty radical left-wing party to sneak into the second round. Now, both of them, both Keiko Fujimori and Pedro Castillo, Keiko Fujimori on the pretty authoritarian right, and Pedro Castillo on a pretty radical, potentially authoritarian left. Both of them have what in the United States we would call high negatives. They're very unpopular, but it was a very, very fragmented field with 18 candidates, none of whom got more than 15% of the overall vote. And both of them, despite being very unpopular, kind of snuck into the second round. So you have two very unpopular candidates against each other.
Wow, that's fascinating. You were quoted on Twitter as saying there are legitimate differences of opinion about who is the lesser evil. Pedro Castillo is not a communist, nor does he represent the Communist Party. Keiko Fujimori is not a Democrat and does not even remotely represent democracy. Can you explain what that comment means and why you felt the necessity to post that?
Sure. The Peruvian media establishment is quite united and quite conservative. And they have rallied it to a stunning degree behind Keiko Fujimori. And all the TV stations, the vast bulk of the newspapers, almost all the talking heads, all the pundits, particularly in Lima, which is very anti-left, have all rallied behind Keiko Fujimori. And the line of this campaign in favor of Keiko Fujimori has been that this is an election about communism against democracy, almost as if we were in Eisenhower's US. It's communism against democracy. Now, Pedro Castillo comes from the left. He's leftist. He is not a communist. What he's proposing is not a state takeover of the economy or single party rule. There's nothing remotely communist about him. And Keiko Fujimori, again, she's right of center. She's for defending the free market model, but she's got a horrendous track record when it comes to democracy. Not only her father, not only her party, but her. Her party had a majority in Congress between 2016 and 2020 and spent that time trying to pack the courts and overthrow the government of Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, which it eventually did. They engaged in very reckless anti-institutional behavior, even since 2016. So this idea, which is being sold to Limeños in particular, Peruvians, day after day after day after day by every freaking television station, is that it's a battle of communism against democracy. These are both flawed candidates. They both are, neither of them are committed Democrats. They are both threats and risks in different ways. But Castillo is not a communist, and Fujimori is not a Democrat.
You invited Keiko Fujimori to Harvard a few years back. Was that a mistake? And what is your takeaway from your perspective of today about that visit?
Interesting to reflect. No, I don't think it was a mistake. I think it's really important in universities that we expose ourselves and our students to a variety of different political points of view. So I am politically no fan of Keiko Fujimori, but we've brought over the last decade to Harvard almost every leading figure in Peruvian politics. We brought Pedro Castillo, we brought Alejandro Toledo, we brought Veronica Mendoza on the left, we brought Julio Guzman in the center. We tried to bring Yanto Mala, but he declined. So there's a tendency, and there's sometimes a tendency to only invite to speak the people who we agree with. And I think that is a terrible, terrible mistake, both in terms of keeping ourselves informed, but most importantly, teaching our students. And so to me, it's very important that we bring people of diverse ideological views to Harvard to speak. Keiko Fujimori was at the time, it was just before the 2016 election campaign, but she was very likely to be a frontrunner. She had a good chance to win the presidency, to be president. And so I thought it was very important that we have a sense of her views, her commitment, for example, to democracy and other things. So I think meeting her, being able to question her, debate with her was a very, very important thing. Now, she took a position here at Harvard. She tried to take advantage of her visit here to reinvent herself a little bit as more centrist and more liberal. And it turned out, for reasons that I don't think we fully understand, to be more of a feint than an evolution. She went back to Peru and sort of pretty quickly moved back to the right. Now, some people think of this, in fact, I think the majority view is that she was kind of BSing us at Harvard and kind of putting on a false image where deep down she was really right wing. I think it's actually a little more complicated than that. I think she thought very seriously about a more centrist turn, and for a variety of reasons, it didn't work out, so she fell back on the right. But no, I don't regret it. I learned a lot. I think the people who met with her and who attended her talk learned a lot. And again, I think Harvard should invite a wide range of people. I personally draw the line at human rights violators. Mm-hmm. I would never invite somebody who had blood on her or his hands. But look, we brought Correa. We brought people on the left who are not fully committed to democracy. We brought people on the right who are not fully committed to democracy. We've brought people who are implicated in corruption. If we only bring our friends and we only bring angels, we're not going to be able to bring many people.
That's really true. Going back directly to the elections, in the first round of these elections, there were many, many blank votes. What role do you think that blank votes are going to have in this election? And are the blank votes favoring one candidate or another?
That's a great question. We really don't know. Historically, it's very common in Peru that the two people who make it into the runoff are pretty unpopular, and a lot of people respond in the first couple of weeks after the first round by saying, "Oh God, they both are terrible. I'm going to vote blank or null my vote." And over time, Peruvians are quite sophisticated in figuring out who they think the mal menor, the least bad candidate is. And once they reach that decision, once they decide, okay, they both are awful. I spent 2 weeks denouncing how awful they were, but I realized one of them can be my president. and this person is slightly less awful, and they decide to vote for that person. Many, many, many Peruvians have gone through that process in the last few elections, and that's happening already. In fact, we've seen a number, I would say a larger number of people who never, ever, ever thought they would ever vote for Keiko Fujimori. Do not like Keiko Fujimori, or consider themselves anti-Fujimorista, who look at Pedro Castillo. Maybe they were influenced by this communism campaign in the media. Maybe they were influenced by the fact that Castillo is a really inexperienced, inept candidate. But they've reached a decision over the last few weeks that as much as they despise Keiko Fujimori, they're going to vote for it. And so the number of blank and null ballots according to polls is going down, and mostly going into Keiko Fujimori's camp. So she started the second round maybe 15 points behind, and now it's nearly a tie. So a lot of the people who 3 weeks ago said they were going to vote blank are now saying they're going to vote for Keiko Fujimori.
I've heard that a lot of people in the middle class and upper middle class have said that they're voting for Castillo. Is that true? And
depends what you mean by a lot. The vast majority of people in the upper middle class say they're voting for Keiko Fujimori. It's something like 3-to-1 ratio.
Okay.
But there's some.
My question in regards to that is, do you think this is in a kind of slight radicalization because of the protests that are going around the continent, or is it just an anti-Fujimori vote?
I think it is mostly an anti-Fujimori vote. I think if we see a Fujimori government, we may well see Peru take on some characteristics of Chile and Colombia. I think we may see kind of broadly left of center contention, social protest, the likes of which we have not seen in Peru in a long time. But for now, the vast bulk of the votes for Castillo are coming from the interior of the country, from the south, from the central highlands, from the poorest sectors of society. In addition, there is always in every country a sort of middle-class progressive left. Those votes are going for Castillo. But we're not seeing a very large number of well-off Peruvians sort of radicalizing like we see maybe in Chile.
Well, if Castillo is elected, will he be able to govern, given that he's not going to have anything near a majority in Congress?
That's the big question. I think Castillo is going to be, in some sense, a disaster no matter what. Either he will, there are three scenarios. One, he moderates dramatically and accommodates the majority in Congress and the private sector. He'll have the media against him. He'll have the courts against him. He'll have the private sector against him. He'll have the military against him. He'll have a majority in Congress against him. But what does he do? He could just sort of abandon all pretensions of radicalism, kind of like Ollanta Humala did in 2011, and just sort of go with the flow and govern on the center, even center right. That will cause a legitimacy crisis. He'll lose a lot of support, and it'll probably lead to even greater radicalism among those who have been voting for a change. He could do the opposite of that. He could go for it and sort of follow the Chavista, Correa, Evo Morales strategy, maybe try to call a plebiscite for constitutional reform, try to mobilize people. But, and there's certainly a scenario in which that could sort of work out. And that's what people who are voting for, even friends of mine who are voting for Keiko Fujimori that's why they're for Keiko. They're worried about him pulling off a Bolivarian project. I cannot say to you that that is impossible. That's not in the cards. He might pull it off. More likely, though, is if he tries, he fails. He either gets overthrown in a military coup, or he gets removed by Congress, or there are large-scale protests and he's kind of forced to resign. I think he does not have the skill, the experience, or the political strength of an Evo Morales or an Hugo Chavez. And he doesn't have quite the crisis or the military support that Alberto Fujimori had in 1992. My guess is if he tries the radical strategy, he will fail, which means probably Castillo is faced with a sort of damned if he does, damned if he doesn't situation. It's hard to foresee a successful Castillo government.
Can you see a successful Fujimori government?
That depends what you mean by successful. I think Keiko Fujimori is the opposite of Castillo in the sense that she will have the media behind her. She'll have the private sector behind her. She doesn't have a majority in Congress, but there is a right-wing coalition to be built in the Congress. And she's got a fair number of friends in the courts. And if she doesn't, she's going to be able to pack the courts within a couple of years anyway. So she's got the winds behind her, which means that she is more likely to be able to govern for 5 years, to establish governability, to maintain the status quo, to maintain order. But I think this would be a pretty illiberal government. I think this would be a government in kind of with a sort of an Uribista flavor. It would be very anti-left. It will come to power with a mandate. Again, remember, this is democracy. I'm putting up quotes in my hands, air quotes. Democracy against communism, right? She will have a mandate to go after the so-called communists. And so I would be, and she has allies who have a very, very sort of law and order authoritarian attitude, and other allies who are sort of ideologically committed to this sort of Christian defense of family and assault on gay rights and gender rights. I think you'd see the rights of social movements and of other vulnerable minorities pretty seriously threatened under Fujimori. I think this would be a kind of Uribe-style democradura that would also be very costly in terms of democratic institutions. So she might succeed from her own standpoint. I think she's less likely to end up sort of in the street, overthrown. But I think it would be very costly for democracy.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned a couple of times the armed forces. What's been the role of the armed forces in this election?
Well, it's not entirely clear. The armed forces were pretty quiet in Peru for a couple of decades after they were really deeply implicated in the corruption of the Fujimori era. And after Fujimori's fall, the military really adopted a low profile for a good 15 years. But in recent years, as politics has grown more fragmented and more unstable, weak politicians have turned to the military for support. Martín Vizcarra had no political party. He was a vulnerable president. Congress was trying to bring him down. And in the first effort to remove him, he actively mobilized the military and had a photo op surrounded by the military command in an effort to legitimize himself. That is not a healthy use of the military. That is, in effect, a Democratic politician running to the barracks door for help. When the first time that Congress tried to remove Vizcarra, the president of Congress called the military command and tried to get the military on board. That is not a democratic appeal to the military. That's knocking on the barracks door. There is concern. There have been some interventions, mostly by former military officials, not military officials, but former military officials and organizations of former military officials they just a few days ago wrote a letter late at night to President Sagasti that looked like it was written in 1972, talking about chaos and making sort of allusions to subversion. It could have been written in Uruguay in the early 70s or Argentina in the early 70s. And I found it very frightening. Now, that doesn't mean that the military is ready to intervene, but there is now a sort of specter of military intervention in Peru that did not exist 5 years ago.
Mm. In Peru, there's something called la vacancia, which I think translates loosely as the removal of a president if they're not performing up to par. How do you see that as figuring into the way the newly elected president will act? Could it provide a moderating force, both in terms of authoritarian behavior or in terms of leftist behavior?
Well, it can do one of two things, unfortunately. The vacancia. So the vacancia is the ability of Congress to remove the president really on almost any grounds. They call it moral incapacity. Nobody knows what moral incapacity means. So you can remove someone based on moral incapacity for anything. And unfortunately, and any institution of impeachment or removal of a president in a democracy has to be used with great restraint. You have to be really, really careful about before you break the glass and use that tool, right? This is an elected president, and Congress removing an elected president is a very big deal. It is a BFD. And unfortunately, in Peru, it has been kind of normalized, and people are breaking it. They broke the glass, and now they're just reaching in without even fixing the glass, right? They tried to use it 4 times in the last presidential term, and it was used successfully twice. So now it's very much in play. It's right out there on the table. And that can have 2 effects. It can have a positive effect in the sense that you suggest, June, in which either Fujimori or Castillo will be aware of that, afraid of that, and behave himself accordingly. But there's another scenario, and this happened in 1992 in Peru, which is if the president is backed into a corner and feels like or fears that the Congress is about to remove him, he may pull out all the stops and try to close Congress. And that is exactly what happened with Fujimori in 1992. And so that the institution of vacancia can check the president, but it can also threaten the president. And in that sense, could provoke an even wider and more damaging political war.
Mm-hmm. When I'm not a follower close up of Peruvian politics, but it seems to me that Peru has been unusual in the last decades because the issues of the economy are separated from the issues of politics. And I'm wondering if you feel, or if there are any indications, especially after the COVID crisis or with the COVID crisis, that that's no longer the case.
I think there are indications. I mean, the strange thing about Peru in between 2002, 2003, and 2016 was that Peru's economy was booming. It was just booming by macroeconomic standards. President Alejandro Toledo, President Alan Garcia, and to some extent, President Ollanta did really well. They governed over steady, high levels of economic growth. And yet all 3 of them were unpopular. So, Toledo's approval rating fell into single digits. Garcia's hovered in the 20s throughout his presidency, despite 8% economic growth. And Humala's also descended into the 20s and 30s, despite pretty high economic growth. So the separation was usually almost everywhere in the United States and other countries. When the economy is booming, the president does pretty well. In Peru, the economy boomed and the president did pretty crappy. People were judging the presidents for other things: corruption, poor performance of the state, the fact that presidents never kept their campaign promises. They said one thing in the campaign and did another. Peruvians did not trust and did not like their politicians, despite the economic boom. So what's happened in the last few years, even before COVID, but especially with COVID, the economy is a disaster. Peru, all of Latin America suffered an economic decline over the last year and a half. Peru's is among the worst in Latin America, a terrible, terrible contraction of its GDP. So governments, politicians, presidents were unpopular to begin with, even when the economy was growing. Now the economy is collapsing. We don't know how low politicians are going to fall, but we got one indicator in this last election when a candidate nobody had ever heard of, or very few people had heard of, who'd never held elected office, what came in first place in the first round of the presidential election. So there is a lot of discontent in Peru. If Castillo wins this election, despite the fact that all of Lima's establishment, all of the media, all the main political parties are behind Keiko Fujimori. If Castillo wins, this agriculturalist from a small town in Cajamarca beats, who no one knows, who has no experience, who's obviously inept in terms of his political skills. If he wins, yeah, it's a sign of massive public discontent. And so Peruvians were discontent with their politicians while the economy was good, and now the economy is bad.
Some people have talked about this election as being between the urban and the rural, in the disenfranchised rural in Peru. Do you see it that way? What comments do you have about that?
You know, I haven't been in Peru in the last couple of years, and I have never met Pedro Castillo. I don't know his political party. I don't know the people around him. And I haven't studied in granular detail the surveys well enough to know the real base of support. So at some level, yes, there's no question that the overwhelming support, that rural areas, that so-called marginalized or forgotten rural areas are overwhelmingly for Castillo, whereas urban areas, in particular well-off urban areas, reasonably well-off urban areas, are overwhelmingly for Keiko Fujimori. That is true. But there's been a lot of economic growth in rural areas in recent years. I mean, to cast Lima as booming and the periphery of the country as somehow, stuck in the 1960s is just not true. Rural Peru has also boomed in the last few decades. It's boomed more in the towns, more in some areas than others, more in the towns than in other areas. But there aren't enough Peruvians who've been left behind entirely to get Pedro Castillo elected president. It's more than just the rural left behind. More people are angry than just the rural poor. And I think we just have not. This is Pedro Castillo is such a new phenomenon that we just don't really yet know enough about his support.
Mm-hmm. What does the outcome of this election mean for the region?
It probably doesn't mean very much. Peru often is kind of follows its own path in terms of regional trends. Like when South America experienced a wave of right-wing military coups in the 1960s and early 70s, Peru experienced a left-wing military coup. When all the region democratized in the 1990s, Peru fell back into authoritarianism. When all of the region had a left turn in the first decade of the 21st century, Peru did not. So Peru is rarely sort of symptomatic of the rest of the region. I think, if Keiko wins, there was talk a few years ago about a regional turn to the right. That's really not happening. I mean, there haven't been other Bolsonaros. Duque in Colombia is failing miserably. The right in Chile is failing miserably. The right in Argentina was knocked out of power after one term. So I don't think it means a resurgence of the right necessarily, although we do see a march from a more liberal center right, the Macris and the Piñeras and the Santoses, to the Uribismos and the Casts and the Bolsonaros and the Fujimoris. So this is maybe one step further toward a more illiberal right. If Castillo wins, the left will cheer, but the left is not exactly making resurgence in the region either. And to the extent that it is, like in Chile, it is very fragmented, very ill-defined. So I don't think this is going to be a sort of part of a wave in either direction. I do think, though, that unfortunately, under either government, Peru's fragile democratic institutions are going to be at risk.
Would you care to elaborate on that?
Neither of these two candidates, nor the people surrounding them, or the major forces supporting them, are committed to liberal democratic institutions. Keiko Fujimori continues to be surrounded by elements that were either supporters of her father's authoritarian regime, members of her father's authoritarian regime, part of the political party that spent 4 years trying to destroy the presidency of Kuczynski between 2016 and 2020. This is just not, it's difficult to find committed liberal Democrats among the Fujimorista forces. Pedro Castillo is a classic sort of 1970s era leftist. I mean, it's all about lo que dice el pueblo, whatever the people says. Super plebiscitarian. I've seen very, very few liberal instincts in him in the sense of protecting the right of free press, individual rights, human rights, the right to dissent, the right to protest. This is not to say he's going to be Fidel Castro incarnated, but if you, as we learn in the United States, if you elect as president somebody who's not committed to liberal democracy, and I think it's safe to say neither Keiko Fujimori nor Pedro Castillo is committed to liberal democracy, then you're putting your institutions at risk. Is it a guarantee that democracy will die? No, of course not. But it introduces an element of risk. And I think the risk with Castillo, actually, I would say in both cases, there's the risk that Castillo does something damaging to democratic institutions. There's also a great risk that Castillo will provoke a coup, that his opponents will damage democratic institutions, as occurred with Fernando Lugo in Paraguay, for example. With Keiko Fujimori, I think there's a risk that she will threaten democratic institutions. I think there's also a risk under Keiko Fujimori that you'll see, as I mentioned earlier, possibly a really widespread reaction against her, potentially a level of social mobilization that we haven't seen in Peru in a long time, that would bring Peru a little closer to Colombia and Chile. And that, as in Colombia and Chile, that can also lead to at least a governability crisis, if not a level of violence that's very costly to democracy.
Mm-hmm. I know this isn't a horse race, but would you care to bet on what's going to happen?
I have been wrong so many times in predicting Peruvian elections that it would be silly of me to try.
I invite you to be wrong once more.
I had thought after the first round, before I saw the polls, that the Peruvian electorate has been fairly conservative the last 25 or 30 years, for very good reason, right? The Peru suffered a crisis in the late 1980s and the 1990s, the likes of which most of us can't even imagine. And the combination of a bloody Maoist insurgency and hyperinflation and economic collapse. So the stability and economic improvements that Peru has achieved over the last generation and a half now is nothing to be scoffed at. And it's understandable that Peruvians, particularly middle-class Peruvians, particularly coastal Peruvians, feel they have a lot to lose today, if you compare it to, say, 1990. And so my expectation was that at the end of the day, more Peruvians would choose what they perceive to be a safer, more status quo-oriented option, Keiko Fujimori, than Pedro Castillo. I expected Keiko would lead in the polls. I was wrong. Castillo was ahead in the polls. It's tightened. And I think if I had to bet a sol or a dollar, I would put it on Keiko Fujimori, which means that all of you who are out there listening should probably place your money on the other side, because I am often wrong when I predict an election.
Thank you very much, Steve. We've been listening to Steve Levitsky, the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies and a professor at the government department at Harvard. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, June. It was a lot of fun.